a scar that could never be erased in the French psyche. When Damien's body was torn apart by the king's soldiers, the crowd recoiled, not in awe, but in horror. On March 28, 1757, a heavy silence hung over the grim square in Paris. The air was thick with an unsettling anticipation, as tens of thousands of people packed every inch of space. Some clung desperately to windows, rooftops, and even chimneys, while nobles paid outrageous sums for the privilege of balcony views. The crowd had traveled from every corner of France, some journeying for days, all drawn by the promise of witnessing a gruesome spectacle, unlike any the country had ever seen before. It was to be the most elaborate and terrifying execution in French history. At the center of the square, a wooden scaffold stood, a chilling monument to what was about to unfold. Soldiers struggled to maintain order as the tension in the crowd mounted, whispering rumors about the condemned man, a mere servant, they said, who had dared to raise his hand against the sacred body of the king. His punishment would be like no other. The cart that brought him into the square creaked under the weight of Robert-François Damiens, a 42-year-old domestic servant, pale and almost unrecognizable after months of brutal torture in the dungeons of the Bastille. His crime, a petty attack on King Louis XV with nothing but a small pocket knife, causing only a superficial wound. The motive behind the attack remained a mystery. But one thing was clear: the French crown would use this event to send a horrifying message. The execution was designed to crush any whisper of dissent against royal authority. As Damien was strapped to the scaffold, the crowd murmured about the rumors surrounding him. Some claimed he was possessed. Others believed he was a puppet of seditious philosophers, and a few said he was simply mad. The whispers fell silent as the executioner appeared, holding tools that would carve his fate in the most grotesque way imaginable. Robert-François Damiens was born in January 1715 in the shadow of an obscure village called Latil, hidden deep in northern France, the son of a gatekeeper. His life seemed fated to be nothing more than an endless cycle of servitude. From a tender age, Damiens worked for aristocratic families. Though his reputation remained as fickle as the winds, his temper, as volatile as a storm, cost him many jobs. Yet there were times when his devotion to duty earned him fleeting praise. People spoke of him as a man ruled by his moods, a servant whose behavior was as unpredictable as the tides. His path was anything but ordinary. He drifted between noble residences and even spent time at Versailles Palace itself, where he had the rare chance to observe the court's decadent life from a distance. But his time there was brief, often cut short by his sudden disappearances or dismissals for insubordination. Damiens was a man who spoke dangerously, engaging in impassioned debates about religion and politics topics that could cost a man his life in a France where the king's absolute power was entwined with divine will. The world around him was fractured by a growing unease. Louis XV, once beloved by the people, had become a figure of contempt. The crushing weight of military defeats, rising taxes, and a king more concerned with indulgence than governance ignited unrest. Amidst the chaos, the Enlightenment grew bolder, challenging the very foundations of monarchy. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church and Jansenists waged their own wars against the crown. In this storm of rebellion, the seemingly ordinary Damiens committed an act that would plunge France into an era of horror. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. One subscribe from you will be a huge encouragement for us to grow the channel and create even better content in the future. A heartfelt thank you to my dear friends for quietly watching my videos. On the bitter afternoon of January 5, 1757, the air around Versailles Palace seemed to thicken with an eerie stillness. King Louis XV, wrapped in thick layers of clothing to shield himself from the cruel cold, was descending from his carriage after visiting his ailing daughter. The king, barely aware of his surroundings, did not see the shadow that approached him from behind. A flash of steel, a glint of cold purpose. Damiens, a lowly servant, had driven a small blade between the ribs of the monarch. The wound was shallow, more of a scratch than a mortal blow. At first, Louis XV believed he had merely been jostled in the bustling crowd, but as he looked down, the warm blood staining his hands told a different story. "I am stabbed," he muttered in shock, then commanded, "Stop that man, but do not kill him." Though the injury was slight, the king's mind raced with one terrifying fear: had the blade been poisoned? But the fear was unfounded, for Damien had no such intention. Damien, standing still as stone, made no move to escape when the guards seized him. He uttered chilling words: "Let no one touch the king. I have something to tell him." But what words could he have possibly wanted to share with the very monarch he had just attacked? This haunting question would remain unanswered, buried beneath the weight of what followed. Under interrogation, Damien gave answers as contradictory as the man himself. At times he hinted at religious motivations, drawing on the contentious Jansenist disputes. At other times his words drifted into vague complaints about the kingdom's poor governance and the suffering of its people. "If I had wanted to kill the king," he insisted, "I would have killed him." His act, he claimed, was not assassination, but a protest, a desperate cry for justice. The French authorities, desperate to uncover a wider conspiracy, subjected him to unspeakable torture. But after 2 months of brutality, no evidence surfaced of accomplices. Damien appeared to have acted alone, driven perhaps by seditious whispers in the taverns of Paris, where revolution hung heavy in the air. The idea that a mere servant could defy the king in such a way was more terrifying than any conspiracy. It was a crack in the foundation of the ancient regime, the belief that the monarch was untouchable, divinely ordained. Damien's trial was a formality. The Parliament of Paris, despite its conflicts with Louis XV, wasted no time condemning him to the brutal punishment of regicide. Even though the king had barely been harmed, the sentence was final. On March 26, 1757, the details of his grisly fate were laid out with chilling precision. And so, on a cold March morning, Damien, more dead than alive from months of torture, was bound to the scaffold, a broken man awaiting the final, grotesque act. Henry Sanong, the executioner, was a man born into a lineage of death, his profession passed down through generations. As he approached Damien, his face grim and expressionless, the red-hot pincers in his hands gleamed ominously in the dim light. What followed was so grotesque, so horrifying, that even the most hardened observer, Casanova, who had attended the execution, later confessed, "I returned home sick and feverish." The execution unfolded with chilling precision, every stage more harrowing than the last. First, Damien's right hand, the very one that had held the knife against the king, was seized and burned with flaming sulfur. The searing heat scorched his flesh, but that was only the beginning. With a cruel twist, pieces of his skin were torn away with the red-hot pincers, digging into his chest, arms, thighs, and calves. The air was thick with the stench of burning flesh as molten lead. Boiling oil, wax, and sulfur were poured into his open wounds, each drop a fresh torment. The crowd, once eager for the spectacle, began to faint, overcome by the unimaginable suffering unfolding before them. Even seasoned soldiers, those who had seen death in many forms, turned their eyes away. But the final act was yet to come, the quartering, for strong horses were tethered to Damien's limbs and driven in opposite directions. Yet, to the horror of all, the human body proved strangely resilient. After 30 minutes of frantic pulling, Damien's limbs had not yet detached. Whispers of divine retribution rippled through the crowd, a feeling that the punishment exceeded even God's justice. In a final, desperate attempt, the executioner asked permission to make incisions at Damien's shoulders and hips to aid the horses. After nearly an hour of unimaginable agony, Damien was torn apart. His remains were burned, and the ashes scattered to erase any trace of his defiance. Please share your thoughts in the comments section. I will discuss this case with you in more detail. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Damien's death had the opposite effect of what the French crown had hoped for. Instead of reinforcing the king's unchallenged power, it revealed the fragile nature of his rule. The brutal execution became seared into the collective memory of France, a chilling reminder of state violence. Philosophers like Voltaire pointed to it as a grotesque example of the cruelty that defined the ancient regime. In the years that followed, as revolutionary fervor began to brew, Damien's execution was often cited in pamphlets calling for change. Though King Louis XV survived the assassination attempt, The attack marked the beginning of the end of his reign. For the next 18 years, his popularity dwindled, and his image as the beloved king was tarnished. He became the object of mockery and contempt, and the memory of Damien's grisly execution only intensified the growing criticisms of his decadent rule. When Louis XV died in 1774, few mourned his passing. His reign, once celebrated, was now viewed as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in France. Damien's execution, however, was the last of its kind in French history. As the Enlightenment's influence spread, public opinion began to shift against the use of such extreme punishments. By the time the French Revolution erupted in 1789, just 32 years later, Louis XVI would face execution as well, but his death by guillotine was swift, almost merciful in comparison. Despite the revolution's own bloodshed, it never recreated the savage spectacle that had defined the death of Damien. 2 centuries later, the philosopher Michel Foucault would revisit Damien's execution in his work Discipline and Punish, using it as a key example of the old methods of power. For Foucault, this brutal public display of punishment represented a deeply different form of authority, a force that operated by physically demonstrating its power over the bodies of the condemned. In contrast, modern systems of discipline and surveillance control through subtler, psychological means. What makes Damien's story so disturbing is not only the horror of his execution, but the mystery of his motives. Was he a religious zealot, an early revolutionary, a madman, or simply a man broken by despair, acting in a moment of defiance against the divine order? Whatever the truth, Damien's death marks a dark turning point in history when the sacredness of the king's body was shattered, and any challenge to it was met with the most horrific retribution imaginable. The story of Robert-François Damiens reminds us of the dangers of power when it's abused. It shows us that no one should be above question or punishment, no matter how powerful they are. In our own lives, we should always choose kindness, fairness, and understanding over cruelty. History teaches us not to repeat the mistakes of the past. We should work towards a world where justice and compassion replace violence.